Welcome to the OnScript podcast, your home for world-class conversations on scripture and theology, where you get to meet some of the best in the field. Visit us at onscript.study. Say hello on Twitter at OnScriptPodcast and stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/OnScript.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the OnScript podcast. This is Matt Lynch coming to you from Regent College in Vancouver. We've got a brand new episode for you here, and this one was recorded locally in person with one microphone, so the audio is not quite as strong as normal, but content's great, and we hope you enjoy it. Thanks so much for all those of you who support us and share the word about this podcast. Feel free to continue to let others know about what we're doing here at OnScript and on the Biblical World podcast if you haven't checked that out. And also just to let you know, we have a few episodes in the works on the In Parallel podcast, which is on a podcast stream that we have that we've done a short series in the past with Brent Strawn on the intersection between poetry and the Bible, contemporary poetry and the Bible. So you could, if you've never listened to it, you could listen to those back episodes. They're a different kind of podcast and style. I think you'll really enjoy it if you haven't heard it. But we've got some in the works for hopefully in the next 4 or 5 months. So thanks for listening and enjoy the episode.
Hello, OnScript listeners. This is Erin Heim coming to you from Wycliffe Hall at the University of Oxford. Our guest today is Professor David Toombs, who is here to talk to us about his work on Jesus as a victim of sexual abuse. David Toombs is the Howard Paterson Professor of Theology and Public Issues at the University of Otago, and he's been working on this topic for a long time now, but he's just published another book on the topic with Routledge called The Crucifixion of Jesus, Torture, Sexual Abuse, and the Scandal of the Cross. This is an important book on a difficult and important topic, and I'm really pleased to welcome David to OnScript to talk about it. David, welcome to OnScript.
Thanks, Erin. It's great to be here.
As you might have guessed, this is a sensitive topic, so if you're listening where children might hear, or if this is a particularly triggering issue for you, you might want to just be forewarned of that and perhaps switch over to something else at this point and save this for another time. But we'll jump right in to talk about this, because David, as I said, has been working on it for a long time. So, David, I wonder if you could tell us about how you came to start working on the topic of sexual violence to begin with.
Sure. So it's a real pleasure to be back in Oxford because I actually did my undergraduate theology and philosophy here. And it was during that time that I became very interested in Latin American Liberation Theology. And that was an area of concern that stayed with me. I did a master's at Union Theological Seminary and had an opportunity to travel to Central America at the end of that year. And then after a couple of years, started a PhD in Christology, looking at the work of John Sobrino and particularly his notion of the crucified people. So it was during that time when I was working on liberation theology and particularly how liberation theologians read the Bible that I did a piece of work, a chapter for a book, Approaches to the New Testament, explaining the liberation theology approach to biblical hermeneutics. And one of the issues that came up for me there was the criticism that liberation theologians read into the text, not out of the text. And I thought that was an unfair criticism of liberation theologians. For various reasons, I came across a story of a terrifying misogynistic execution of a young woman in El Salvador. And I really wanted to think through how to understand two things. First of all, the violence or sexualized violence of that execution. And secondly, the silence that went with it. Why was it that execution was unspeakable in general terms and particularly missing in theological reflection? And that particular execution was the prompt for me to start reading torture reports and how common sexual violence is in torture reports. And that in turn took me to doing a piece of work, a paper at SBL first, and then it became an article in 1999, looking at crucifixion in terms of state terror and sexual abuse.
That's about 15 years from when you first started perhaps working on this or thinking about liberation theology to when.
That's exactly right. So I first started, I picked up Gustavo Gutierrez's book here in Oxford in Blackwell's bookshop in 1985. And it was in 1998 that I did the SBL paper.
Wow. I know we have quite a few younger listeners who are probably going, well, how does this relate to kind of world history? And I'm not sure if many people would be as familiar perhaps of what was going on in Latin America during the late 80s and early 90s that kind of made this a live issue. Would you be willing to give just a brief overview of?
Yeah. So in the 1980s, it was towards the end of the Cold War, though, of course, in the 1980s, nobody knew that at the time. And Central America was really the front line for some of the conflicts that were being waged, not directly, but ideologically, and as it were, through proxy, in terms of the US massively funding authoritarian regimes and military regimes in Central America, particularly El Salvador and Honduras, against a perceived or imagined socialist threat. Nicaragua, from 1979, its revolution had a socialist government, a Sandinista government, so that gave some urgency to this. And El Salvador became notorious for the tolerance that the US had for state terror abuses by the right-wing military government of the time.
And during that period of time, that's when you spent a year at Union Seminary. And can you talk to us about what your trip was like when you went after your master's degree?
So one of the extracurricular things I'd done at Union was served as editor for the Central American Task Force magazine, which was an in-house publication, very informal, but just keeping people abreast of what was going on in Central America. Many in the seminary community had strong church commitments, and a number of churches were part of solidarity work around this issue. So one of the things I was trying to do was keep people up to date in what was happening, and particularly what the US government was doing. The US government was not distant to this, but very much bankrolling what was happening, particularly in El Salvador. So that had been part of my experience during the academic year 87-88. And at the end of that year, I had the opportunity to travel down by bus through the US, across the border, across through Mexico, through Guatemala, managed to pick up a tiny bit of Spanish on the way, and had just over a week in El Salvador visiting a college roommate of my now wife, who was working right on the edge of the area which was controlled by the government, vis-a-vis the area not controlled by the government. And that was really eye-opening in terms of the sense of threat, the sense of fear, the military presence, how much the military controlled day-to-day life. The conflict at that point was still very much happening. It would come to an end in the 1990s. But in 1988, it was still very, very present.
And during that time at Union, you also studied under James Cone, if I've read your book correctly.
You absolutely have.
And you have this really striking just paragraph about James Cone and James Cone's insistence to his students that you not just look at the questions people are asking, but you look at the silences. What silences stuck out to you, I suppose, then? And then also, what silences stick out to you now?
So James Cone was an incredibly powerful teacher to study under. I mean, he's well known, of course, as a writer and a scholar, and that's absolutely right. But he also had a really powerful presence in the classroom. And when he said things, students were really privileged to hear what he had to say. And I remember him pointing out that when you're doing your reading, it's not just reading the content, but processing, thinking about, well, what are the questions which are being asked here? But going beyond just, well, what are the questions being asked, to what are the questions not being asked? And why are those questions not being asked? Who has decided which questions are going to be foregrounded and pursued and which questions are going to be left aside as not so important? So at that stage, I just think I took that on as good advice for anyone working in theology. But I think it was that advice that I had in mind when, during a subsequent visit to El Salvador, I went back during my doctoral studies in 1996. And it was just after that visit that I read this story about the execution. And it was his advice in mind that made me think, so why aren't people asking questions about this? Or if they are asking questions, they're not writing about it. They're not discussing it. John Sobrino, who is just an extraordinary, insightful and profound systematic theologian who has written about the crucified people, understanding Jesus and the crucifixion in the light of the Salvadoran people and understanding their experience metaphorically, at least as crucifixion. And even in that, even in Sobrino's work that I admire so much, there was no mention of the type of violence that this young woman had experienced. And my question was, why not? Why does that violence get left out? Now, in researching an answer to that, I became more aware of other sexual or sexualized violence that gets left out. So famously, at the beginning of the 1980s, 4 US church women, often referred to as the Maryknoll missioners, had been murdered in El Salvador as part of this state terror. And it was well known by almost everyone that they had been raped as well as murdered. But invariably, when that atrocity was reported, it was the murder that was reported. It wasn't the rape. So a process of perhaps avoidance, perhaps silencing, perhaps erasure. The question for me was, well, what's going on here? Why are some things being included and some things being left out?
So in this book, you set the passion narratives alongside contemporary instances of sexual violence and torture. So why is that a helpful approach? What insights do we gain from doing that? And on the other hand, how do you head off from the outset the charge of anachronism?
So for me, because I am so shaped by liberation theology, it's just the approach I tend to take on this sort of issue. Liberation theologians would say, approach the text with questions from your current situation in mind. That's one of the things to be self-aware of as you read the text, and be thinking, how does the text speak to this situation? And that reflects the conviction that what you will see will depend to some extent on how you are looking and the questions that you have in mind, which are shaping the way you approach the text. So that definitely makes sense to me. In terms of how do you avoid anachronism with that, I think it is self-awareness. It's not to imagine that just because you go to the text with particular questions, the text will necessarily address those questions or necessarily say what you might expect it to say. But I think it's entirely reasonable to be aware that you can approach a text, particularly approach on a subject like the cross or crucifixion, with questions which have been raised by understanding torture in mind. In fact, if you don't do that, if you don't have that sort of framework in mind, it's very likely that you will have an anachronistic approach because you will have been shaped in your understanding by something else that you're not aware of. Typically, biblical scholars and theologians, I suspect, are very much shaped by Christian art. What they have in mind when they go to the text is a really rich, powerful, visual tradition where they know what the cross is. So they don't have to worry too much that there's very little in the text on what the cross was actually like, because they already know that's already given to them through the art that they know. So that would be part of an answer, a self-awareness in what you're doing and what you're expecting. Obviously, a choice in what you're making. Are you choosing a topic in the way you approach the text that is likely to have resonances with what what the text may offer. So part of my thinking, at least on this, and it was a process of exploration, it was a belief that I investigated and then felt was confirmed, that the Latin American use of torture demonstrated that torture wasn't just about the individual. It was very much about a message to a wider public. It had a political purpose. So understanding Latin American torture as state terror was a crucial first step. And that mapped, I felt, very well to how the Romans used the cross. That wasn't super original. There weren't so many people writing about the cross as state terror, but nor was it particularly disruptive. That fitted how many biblical scholars and others would think of the cross. It fits the notion of a public execution, a terrifying public event that sends a message to a wider public. So that part of it fit well. The other thing I'd learned in my study of Latin American torture reports was that sexual violence is overwhelmingly common in torture practices. It's almost universal in terms of reading into torture reports. You read about different forms of sexual violence. The one that's so common, it often isn't even named, is for stripping and leaving victims in a state of enforced nakedness. That's almost universal. And then on top of that, there are usually further forms of torture and sexual abuse, not necessarily rape. Often it will be genital beating. It might be other forms of attack on the body or on the genitals, or quite a wide variety. I won't go into further detail, but certainly extending to rape as well. That is not unknown. Now, that was a much bigger and in some ways more challenging question to take to the gospel text, because nobody, I think, would expect that in the gospel text. There's nothing in the visual imagination that I've mentioned, filtered through art, that leads us to expect that that's going to be part of the crucifixion. But my question was, let's look at this. Let's register and recognize that that's a question of, well, if we're thinking of crucifixion as a form of torture, an instrument of state terror, is this third part going to be there as well, the use of sexual violence? Let's at least look at that.
When you've looked at torture reports, etc., could you say just a bit about the function? It's horrific to even think about this, but the function of sexual violence within the context of torture and state terror. Why is that such a powerful device?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question, because it really gets to some of the depth of what's going on here. So there are a number of different answers, and they reinforce each other. So one simple answer is that sexual violence tends to be easily hidden. Sexual violence is the violence that doesn't necessarily leave the marks and the evidence and so on. It depends what form it takes. Obviously, mutilation can leave very obvious physical marks, but other forms of sexual violence doesn't. So the deniability issue is there. That makes sexual violence a preferred instrument for torturers. Another aspect of it is that it goes so deep into the person's own psyche. So sexual violence is where torturers can try to attack and destroy the person from the inside, psychologically, not just physically. And it's so long lasting as well. Other forms of torture one might pass out from, one eventually, hopefully, gets relief from. But the legacy of sexual violence for many torture victims, they will report, has never, ever gone away. That's the one that they wake up to so often.
And so what in the biblical text, what in the Passion accounts leads you to think that Jesus is a victim of sexual abuse, sexual violence?
So I've tried to draw a clear distinction between what I see as the clear and explicit textual basis for recognizing one form of sexual violence that at least initially I thought would be helpful to call that sexual humiliation, and distinguish that from other forms of sexual violence that are more directly physical and think of those in terms of sexual assault. So I'll talk about both of those, and then also just say that now I think, although that's a really helpful distinction, I'm not sure I drew it in quite the best way when I drew it as sexual humiliation and sexual assault. Now I think I would include what I then spoke of as sexual humiliation as a form of sexual assault, and then the other as a further form of sexual assault. But that first form, I think the idea of separation is useful. So the first sort of sexual violence or sexual abuse, and I'm using those terms more or less interchangeably, but we can certainly talk about that, is the stripping and enforced nudity of Jesus. And we see that, I think, clear in the text in terms of the stripping of the cross, which is remembered as the 10th station of the cross in certain liturgical traditions, particularly Catholic and some Anglican. So that's what I would see as explicitly there. John's gospel is a little bit more explicit than the synoptics in terms of talking about the removal of the tunic, not just the clothing. But I think the clear implication in all the gospels is Jesus was stripped naked at the cross. It doesn't explicitly say naked, but I think that is the implication. The first two images we have of Jesus on the cross, or piecing together, I talk about this in my book, if anyone's interested in pursuing it a bit more, show naked figures on the cross. And there's another early crucifixion figure which is naked. So I think the scholarly consensus that the Romans crucified victims naked is persuasive. It also seems to be how a number of early church fathers read the crucifixion. Their understanding of it was naked and fully naked on the cross. So I think we have the stripping and forced nudity at the cross. For Mark and Matthew, we also have a really disturbing account of repeated strippings, not just stripping, but repeated strippings in the praetorium. And this, I think, is very plausibly read in the light of torture reports, that the similarity in terms of taking somebody into a detention area, stripping them repeatedly, mocking them, striking them, spitting at them, that all fits really well with torture reports. And Matthew seems to go out of his way to underline the elements which are already there in Mark. So, for example, Mark, Jesus is handed over to be flogged, and very likely if he was flogged, then he would have been naked for flogging, or the flogging itself might well have stripped his clothing away. Mark then has him brought into the praetorium, but doesn't talk about him being stripped again before further mocking. It's only later in the passage where his clothes are put back on him that it's clearly implied, well, he was either naked when he was brought in, or when he was brought in, he was stripped. Matthew goes out of his way, presumably knowing Mark at this point, to clarify that when Jesus is brought into the praetorium, he's stripped. So he seems to be even clearer than Mark to draw our attention to the fact that Jesus is being stripped at this point as part of mockery. So counting up the strippings, if we take Matthew's account, we have two explicit strippings. We have the very likely stripping of the flogging. And then at the end of that passage, they say Jesus is taken away to be crucified, where there's going to be another stripping. So in 6 verses, I think it's Matthew 27, 16 to 31, these 6 verses, you have 2 explicit strippings, 1 referenced stripping at the cross, and a highly likely stripping during flogging. It's incredible for 6 verses to have 4 references to in effect, acts of, as I say, originally I called this sexual humiliation, but the biblical scholar Gerald West, who's also looked at this passage very, very helpfully, has pressed me on that. And he said, look, this is sexual assault. You can't you can't avoid that. And I think he's absolutely right. I think this group stripping needs to be named as a form of sexual assault. I think the other thing that people often miss, and where it starts to come home to them, is we're told in this passage, both by Mark and by Matthew, that the whole cohort are assembled. And if I'm working with a group, either in a church setting or in a classroom setting, I'll throw out the question, well, how many are in a cohort? And again, art has its effect. Most people have from art a picture of the soldiers at the cross. And they're not even always soldiers, but they're 2, maybe 3, possibly 4. And I invite people to sort of bid a bit higher if they're offering numbers. We go up to 12, 50, 100. And you can see people getting increasingly bewildered as the number goes high. It's about 500 soldiers in a cohort. It is an incredibly high number. I believe when Matthew says they assembled the whole cohort, I think he means they assembled the whole cohort. Many commentaries, the first thing they'll do is reassure you that they couldn't possibly have meant the whole cohort, that Matthew is exaggerating here, because a cohort was a large number of soldiers. I think that's exactly why they did assemble the whole cohort, and we should take Matthew on trust here. But even if we don't think it was the whole cohort, Matthew's point is they assembled a very large number of soldiers. So it seems to me what we've got here is an overwhelming number of soldiers who've been gathered to mock and degrade and dehumanize. They're doing it repeatedly, and it really deserves to be named as sexual abuse or sexual violence, because that's what made sense to them. They didn't have the English terms, of course, but in terms of understanding masculinity, military prowess, what it means to be a soldier, what it means to be a victim of soldiers, all of this is highly gendered and very much caught up with masculinity and various sexual and gender dynamics. So to name it as that is not to project something onto the text which is not there. It's to see what's there, which really hasn't been acknowledged before.
I mean, it takes it in. When you read Matthew commentaries, you get this picture that there's just sort of some inappropriate horseplay going on.
Exactly.
And if you say, no, actually, this is a calculated, public display of humiliation in front of a whole cohort of soldiers, where someone is being beaten and stripped of his clothing and paraded, naked in front of, a large number of people, it's a very different feeling in the text. It
is. And because it's such a different feeling, that comes as a shock to people and can be quite confronting, because they've not heard that.
Sure.
The idea that this isn't, I think at least one commentary does call it foolery or something. It's presented as mocking in the sense of silliness rather than deeply abusive mocking. And this brings us on.
And strategic mocking.
And strategic. And intentional.
It is abusive.
And organized, yes.
But it's also, it serves a purpose within the function of crucifixion in the Roman world. And as you say, some of it's wrapped up in this notion of Roman masculinity. So it might be helpful for you to just say something about kind of norms around masculinity and nudity, etc. Some scholars will say, well, there's a different allowance being made because Jesus was Jewish, so he wouldn't have been crucified naked. What do you think about kind of how do we make sense of Jewish, Greek, and Roman ideas about masculinity and nudity in these passion accounts?
Let me start with that last point. The idea that Jesus would not have been crucified naked is the most extraordinary suggestion. It suggests that crucifixion was some due process thing that wanted to respect the dignity of the victims. It was the absolute opposite. There's nothing that would have, to my mind, and this is drawing on torture reports, but there's nothing that pleases the torturer more than to be aware that the victim is particularly sensitive on something. That they're not treating them well, they're treating them badly. So the fact that a victim would find this especially difficult, and I think that part of it is right. A Jewish victim would find it at least as difficult as anyone else. I think it's difficult to raise it above or below, because I don't think anyone finds being stripped and then enforced nakedness and killed naked as easy. But the idea that, so that part of it, this would have been particularly difficult, offensive, disruptive in a Jewish context, is absolutely right. But my argument would be that's exactly why the Romans would have done that. They would not have given a pass. Now, I think it is right that the clothes were put back on Jesus to lead him through the holy city out to Golgotha. And that was about Jewish sensitivities within the holy city. That part of it is in the text. That makes sense. I don't doubt that. But why anyone thinks once outside the city, Jesus was treated in a respectful way, that's the exact opposite of what crucifixion was meant to do. And it just seems not just extraordinary, but deliberately resisting engagement with reality. One of the other Salvadoran liberation theologians I study is Ignacio Ellacuría, close colleague of John Sobrino. And one of his emphasis is that theology has to be willing to engage with the real rather than avoid the real. It's all about engaging with reality. And I have to say the idea that the Romans would have tried to preserve Jesus' dignity on the cross is utterly misguided in my reading, and is a reluctance to engage with the reality that we should engage with. Now, the people who do try to preserve Jesus' dignity on the cross, they're the artists. They're the ones who've provided a little cover of dignity for Jesus on the cross. And I think they're right to do that. I'm not criticizing the artists who have added the loincloth, but it's really important for readers to be aware that that's not in the text. There's no mention of a loincloth in the text, that the artists have added it as a way of preserving dignity. And that's appropriate, but we shouldn't fool ourselves into thinking that that's how it actually was. We've got to be able to look at the reality.
Well, and you've done that certainly in your book, because you have a whole host of primary sources from, and rightly you say, there's not a lot of detail about the sort of the process of crucifixion in the primary text, but the evidence that we do have certainly suggests that victims were crucified naked. For practical reasons, maximal, torture and pain, but also for the sake of humiliation.
Yeah. And actually all the rhetoric around the cross and Roman crucifixions really foregrounds that humiliation aspect. It's not just the pain aspect. It is humiliation and nudity, not just in Jewish understanding, but for Romans, forced nudity was deeply damaging to personal reputation. The voluntary nudity, perhaps in the gymnasium and the baths, was acceptable in certain social situations when one was in control of one's body, when one made choices about it, so on and so on. But it was certainly not acceptable for a Roman citizen or soldier to be stripped by others. That was
a mark of shame.
Shameful. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. And complete loss of reputation and standing.
And how does that overlap with Roman notions of masculinity?
So a Roman sense of masculinity would be linked quite closely to control of the body, and particularly to control and resistance of penetration of the body by others, but affirming of one's entitlement to penetrate supposed social inferiors, those who are lower in the social hierarchy. So in terms of sexual relations, a Roman citizen was entitled or within the social perception was entitled to sexual relations with slaves, male and female, with their own wife, if married, and essentially with the bodies of non-Romans as well. What was not acceptable was penetration of any male Roman citizen by anyone else. So what we would probably think of as homosexual relations, so that term is not straightforward, because that probably wouldn't have been a set sexual identity. But what we would think of as same-sex acts were not acceptable between Roman citizens on the assumption that one of them would be penetrated in the process. So that was seen as unacceptable, because it wasn't just about the individual, it was about the collective. But penetrating other bodies was not just acceptable, it actually reinforced and amplified the Roman sense of assertive, active Roman masculinity. So there's quite a famous statue of the Emperor Claudius standing over Britannia. It's metaphorical, of course, but it's celebrating, in effect, his metaphorical rape of Britannia. And this wasn't seen as a terrible thing. This is seen as what a strong Roman virile emperor should be doing. And I think that attitude permeated the Roman military as well. If anything, they are hyper-masculine. Now, just as a quick side note, before I go back to the second type of sexual violence, the soldiers who took Jesus into the Praetorium, they're referred to in the text as the soldiers of the governor. And it's very appropriate to call them Roman soldiers, but we should note they're probably not Italian Roman soldiers. They're local auxiliaries. So although a lot of what I've been talking of, I think, is sensible in terms of how the Romans see this, there's a further complexity or wrinkle in terms of our historical understanding that the soldiers themselves weren't necessarily, or that there's another layer that we need to think about. But what I've described might fit Pilate quite well, but the actual soldiers are local cohort or auxiliaries.
So let's talk about these second two instances that you identify in the book. So one of them is the possibility that Jesus was further sexually assaulted in the Praetorium, and then the other is the possibility that crucifixion itself involves some element of sexual violence. So let's take those in turn. So what in the text or in contemporary practices of torture leads you to think that this kind of gap in the text might be a meaningful silence that could be filled in with some truly horrific details?
Yeah, so you've put it really well, and you've actually brought in a distinction within the second part. So let me just step back a bit and say, so we've covered what's explicit in the text, the stripping and forced nudity. We're moving into this second area of what may be there, and as you say, there are two possibilities that I'm looking at in the book. What else might have happened in the Praetorium, and could some form of sexual violence have happened on the cross? So what else might have happened in the Praetorium? Again, this for me is bringing questions which have come from torture reports. It's not bringing conclusions or answers, but what torture reports tell us or invite us to at least ask about is almost always stripping is a first act of sexual violence towards other acts. Now, sometimes there are cases where it's just stripping and that's all that's experienced. That is possible. But in many cases, when there's going to be further sexual violence, it starts with stripping. So the question to take to the text is, what do we have in the text here? Do we have just stripping repeatedly and spitting and striking and verbal insults, but no further sexual violence? Or do we have at least the possibility of further sexual violence in the Praetorium? Another thing to bring from torture reports is that there's a great deal of reticence about talking beyond stripping. So there's generally reticence and reservation, particularly for male victims, but female victims as well, being willing to say that they experience sexual violence during torture. It's the one area that they're most reserved on talking about, but the area they might talk about is stripping, but not say more. With that, this is another hermeneutical approach to bring to the text, that we might read the text with a sense of reservation and reticence, and not just assume, well, the text doesn't say there was further sexual violence, therefore there was no further sexual violence. We've got to be aware that sometimes texts don't tell us everything that there was. And of course, we know this. We know texts only give us a partial impression. Our current world, our current torture reports tell us that often sexual violence, additional sexual violence, follows stripping. We also know that it can be very difficult to put together the evidence given this reservation. So we can't expect, as we did with the first type of sexual humiliation or sexual violence, clear, explicit textual affirmation. We have to be clear and honest about that. Are there fragments? Are there hints? Well, there's a very interesting story from Josephus told about the mocking of Herod Agrippa. There's an interesting story of when Herod Agrippa visited Alexandria, but there's an even more interesting story about what happened in Sebaste and Caesarea after the death of Herod Agrippa. And we're told by Josephus that the soldiers, and there were many of them apparently, took the statues or images of Agrippa's daughters, and we're told their ages. I think it's 16, 10 and 6, or even 16, 8 and 6. I think it's 16, 10 and 6, but Josephus tells us their ages. Set them up on the brothels and then did indecent things and insults to them, and some things which were unmentionable. So that's, I think, an interesting passage because it's telling us about how soldiers insult a king of the Jews, in this case, an actual king of the Jews who has died, rather than what soldiers perceive as a usurper king of the Jews who's been handed over to them in person. It's established some sexualized element to their mockery, though in this case that's directed against the statues of the child daughters. And Josephus is explicit in a way that we don't have explicit in the Gospels, that some things are not mentioned. So some things are going to be left out of this account. So that's one story from actually pretty close, within 10 or 15 years of when Jesus was taken into Praetorium, that we have of soldiers mocking a king of the Jews. And actually, I think an argument can be made that those soldiers might well be quite similar to the Roman auxiliaries who took Jesus into the Praetorium. Another possible fragment is the language which is being used. So there is some language which is heard differently when it's applied to men and women, and that might be the case of mockery in this case. So the word for mockery that Matthew uses is the same word as in the Septuagint for what Saul is fearing the Philistines might do to him when they capture him. That they're worried that, Saul is worried that the Philistines will mock him. Now, my suspicion is that is reticent language for what he fears will be sexual assault. Of course, it's very difficult to know that with confidence, but because the word, the Greek word used there, can be used for other forms of mockery as well. Its range is fairly broad, but one of the ways it can be used is for sexual assault. And it seems to me contextually that's the appropriate way for reading it in terms of Saul's anxiety that the Philistines, the uncircumcised Philistines, he mentions that, which seems relevant contextual factor, are going to run him through and mock him when they get him. And that word again, so the same word we have in Matthew 27 that we have in the death of Saul, we also have in the rape of the Levite's wife or concubine in Judges 19. And Barbara Theoday, I hope I'm not mispronouncing her name. Of course, I've read it. I've not met her. So apologies if that's wrong. But she has a brilliant explanation of how the language which is used of the Levite's wife, because she's a woman, everyone just takes as a form of sexual violence, that she was known and mocked or known and abused. Everybody reads that as, famously one of the most graphic texts of terror, to use Dribble's language, in the Bible. And for somebody to say, no, I don't think that was sexual, people would just be incredulous with that. The same word is used for Saul and for Jesus, but for male victims, the overwhelming tendency would not be thinking of mockery as sexual. And again, this has its parallels in more contemporary times as to assumptions about treatment of women, treatment of men, lots of different perceptions and assumptions that people bring to this. It's not, it seems to me, anything like as conclusive as the stripping is for sexual violence, but it's a fragment. One of the really interesting things about this research is biblical scholars on the whole haven't been looking. If they were looking, I think they would start finding these fragments, finding this sort of evidence. For example, just in the last year or so, that I've become aware of a skeletal case of a prisoner of the Romans with very clear evidence that he was sexually assaulted with a spear. Now, that's information I think most biblical scholars wouldn't be aware of. And certainly I've been told many times that there is no evidence for what I'm suggesting. And when I'm told that, I think what's in people's mind is it's not that there's evidence there, we just haven't discovered it yet, or even there might be evidence there, we haven't discovered it yet. It's a categorical, this has been looked into and there is no evidence. Whereas actually it's the opposite. This just hasn't been looked into on the whole. And when you do start looking into it, you do start finding, if not absolutely clear-cut evidence, all sorts of, in this case, so the skeletal remains, that's contextual evidence. That happened in Spain, not in Palestine, but it was about the right period. It at least gives us one example of a brutal sexual assault on somebody in Roman detention who was humiliated in that way. So the idea that this is something which happens in contemporary torture, and we've got lots of evidence from contemporary torture around this sort of sexual violence that happens, the idea that that's only a contemporary thing and it would never happen in the Roman world is nonsense. So the idea, well, there's no evidence of this. Well, the work needs to be done to explore what evidence that there is.
Well, and it's not just, we have so many examples in contemporary torture of sexual violence being used as part of a torture regime. But it's not like it's, there's a Roman Empire and then we have the contemporary and there's nothing in between. I mean, this is like well-worn practice within,
here in the UK, Richard III is now widely recognised as suffering what's often referred to euphemistically as a humiliation wound. Now, again, let's look at our language there.
Sure.
I don't think it's wrong to say euphemistically, but if all we had was the record that he suffered a humiliation wound, it would be hard, I think, to know exactly what happened if you didn't know how that term was being used and what it was being used for. So similarly, we have to understand how acts of deep violence, dehumanizing, degrading, ridiculing take place. And the idea that those would be so completely different for the Romans for how they are now, and there isn't a fairly continuous line where we can find these examples from different points in history, just seems extraordinarily naive.
Yeah, on the one hand, you want to have sympathy for people not wanting to countenance this evidence because it's horrific. But if it's there in the text and it's there in our theological legacy, then I think, and then actually, as you point out in the end of the book, it serves quite an important theological purpose, or it can do. it's important to look at it.
It is. I mean, it's not that everybody should do this, though. Having knowledge recognition that when we're talking about crucifixion, we are talking about unspeakable violence, and to have some sense of, if we were speaking about the unspeakable, what would we be speaking about? That's not to say that everyone should be speaking about the unspeakable, but they should at least know what it was that made crucifixion unspeakable, and that perhaps takes us to the cross.
Yeah, indeed. So why should we think about the cross in this category of sexual violence as opposed to just pain and extreme violence and pain?
I suppose the simple answer is the evidence. And the evidence I have in mind here is the evidence particularly from Seneca. So there are a number of arguments that could be used in terms of general references to the cross in ancient literature, about the shameful cross, the humiliation of the cross, all of which I think provide a contextual impression that there's something very deep and powerful going on with the cross. But the direct textual evidence we have from Seneca, which is not relating to Jesus, it's relating to the use of crucifixion by Romans, but in the first century, so time-wise appropriate, there are a number of really disturbing references, but by a number we're talking 2 or 3. It's not a huge number, but a small number of really disturbing references which are highly suggestive of the cross being used as sexual violence. So one of them, Seneca talks about what he saw in Bithynia, and he talks about different types of crosses, some which stretch out the arms, some where the victim is crucified upside down. Both of these, I think, in Christian imagination, we're very familiar with these. It's no great surprise. But he then adds some, and then it's usually translated as impale the private parts. My suspicion there is anal impalement is what he has in mind. It's not absolutely clear. Then there's another passage where he has quite a long dialogue, and again there's a strong suggestion of anal impalement in terms of crucifixion. Now this is important because almost every scholar who writes on crucifixion will refer to the historical practice of Roman crucifixion developing out of ancient impalement practices. So that there's a sort of history which is told, Hengel would be Martin Hengel's short, brilliant book is a really good example of this, talking about how Roman crucifixion developed in contrast to impalement. So prior to the Romans, there was impalement. With the Romans, there was crucifixion instead of impalement. And this schema neatly divides crucifixion from impalement, and it keeps the two separate. Now, perhaps not everyone would accept that impalement is an inherently sexualized form of punishment. So it's worth distinguishing here between the two common types of impalement that we have from the visual record and historical understanding. One where victims were impaled through the chest and, as it were, left to hang on the cross, which I think somebody saying, well, that's not inherently sexual. I think I would agree with that. There's a penetration of the body, yes, but it's not done in an obviously what I would think of as sexual or sexualized way. But there's the other form of impalement, so-called longitudinal impalement, which is done typically anally. And to my mind, that is a form of grotesque sexual violence. There's perhaps a layer that some people might offer, that there's no obvious pleasure or gratification in that form of sexual violence, but I don't think that's needed for a definition of sexual violence. I think you can have sexual violence which is done to degrade and demean without any gratification for the person doing it, who knows with torturers what sort of gratification they're receiving anyway, but to my mind, it's not necessary. So that form of longitudinal impalement was, to my mind, a long historical practice of public humiliation through an extreme form of sexualized violence. Notionally, we don't have to worry about that for the Romans, because the Romans were a civilized people. They wouldn't do that. They would crucify people. And we've all seen, again, the pictures of crucifixion. There's absolutely no sign of impalement. And therefore, we can all at least not need to worry about cross and crucifixion as a form of impalement. Seneca's passages go against that. They actually say that the Romans somehow managed to either have impalement running alongside crucifixion, or, as I suspect, and my reading of it would be, they've brought the two together some way, and therefore you could have a form of crucifixion which was also impalement. In the book, I recognise that we really don't know. This is difficult territory to look at, and how would this actually work? And Seneca is difficult to read on this. But it seems to me the two possibilities to pursue are that either somehow the cross involved a longitudinal impalement. That, I think, is less likely for most Roman crucifixions, because most Roman crucifixions, the victim was suspended for a long time. And it's likely, though there are some historical stories to the contrary, that a victim of impalement would die very, very quickly of longitudinal impalement. So I think the more likely way it would be done, and what I try to explore a little bit in the book, is it's often observed that Roman crosses had sedulae, seats or pegs. And sometimes this seat or peg is referred to as a horn. And I think at least a physiologically plausible way of doing it, and would be in line, I think, with what Seneca is saying, is there could be a limited form of anal impalement on the horn or peg of the cross, but that wouldn't kill the victim in the way longitudinal impalement would. It would deeply humiliate him. It would undermine and destroy his masculinity, at least in the eyes of the Romans. And they would still be forced to be on the cross for many hours. Potentially, if the understanding of the cross, whereby it becomes difficult to breathe and you have to keep raising yourself on the cross to be able to breathe, you would have a form of repeated sexual violence that the victim himself is subjecting him to in one way. So it's really quite a complex and dense process, but that would be my guess of what Seneca has in mind. Now, is that evidence for what happened to Jesus? I would be the first to say it's not direct evidence. This is what Seneca saw somewhere else. But it does tell us how the cross was seen by others. When people hear Jesus was crucified, when they hear he was on the cross, I think it's much more plausible that they have in mind what Seneca has described. Is it possible that Jesus was subjected to that? I think we have to say it is possible. We've got that evidence. There's nothing that excludes it, but nor would I say that there's sufficient that we could say that's what happened. In fact, far away from that. To my mind, we're nowhere near saying that with any sort of confidence. But what we are saying is possibilities. So to go back to my overall framework, I think we have to say, based on the stripping and enforced nudity, that the text affirms that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse. If pressed, can we get behind the text for history? I think we'd trust the text on this. There's no reason that's in the text if that's not what at least the gospel writers believed that the history was. In terms of what else may have happened, it's going back to James Cone saying, look at the questions which are not being asked. These questions about what else happened in the praetorium, what else happened in the cross, have barely been asked. It's starting to happen now. You yourself have written on this, so I know you know this, but very little has really been done on it. But it seems to me, my argument would be that this is responsible questioning. It's not irresponsible questioning to ask these questions. It's to take seriously the reality of what the cross was and what it meant, though, as you know, I think there are also potentially pastoral positive possibilities that might come out of this. These don't justify reading the cross this way. I'm not suggesting we should read the cross this way because it opens up these potentially positive pastoral possibilities. We should read the cross this way because that's being authentic to the scholarly task of trying to discover the truth as best we can. But if, in light of that, they're positive pastoral possibilities, then those should be explored as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do you think, David, it's such an offensive notion that Jesus was the victim of this horrific sexual violence? Why is that? Why is it something that Christians recoil from?
This ties things together really well. The cross was meant to be offensive, that the cross was meant to be scandalous.
Yeah.
Paul goes out of his way.
But that's what he preaches.
That. Yes, that's right. He then actually preaches this, despite the scandal, he will preach it.
Or maybe even because of the scandal.
Maybe because of the scandal, but only because of the scandal in the light of the resurrection.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. It's even the cross has been overcome through resurrection, or has been set in a different perspective through resurrection. I think it is so scandalous because it was. So that part of it is not surprising when people say, well, this is really scandalous and offensive. That actually is absolutely right. And that's how the Romans intended it to be, because they didn't want their victims to be remembered or to be heroic. And this made it really difficult to remember the victim and really difficult to think of the victim as heroic. So other forms of execution or death, you can have a hero's death, perhaps somebody who nobly endures death. At least in the Roman mind, there was just no possible way you could nobly experience crucifixion. It was just utterly impossible. And that was absolutely the point. And today, when people are deeply offended at this, that is their success. They are saying the cross makes it impossible to think of the one crucified in a positive way. I think other things are going on as well. That there's never been any really deep work on Jesus' sexuality. Perhaps overstating here. There's been lots of interesting work, but it's not been widespread. There's not been a huge amount of careful work on Jesus' sexuality and what that means and how to understand it, at least that most people in churches would be familiar with. And therefore, when they encounter the idea that Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse, which is very different from, understanding his sexuality, it's not in any way to equate those. But if you haven't even had the conversation around, could we talk about Jesus and his sexuality? Most church people, I think, would be thrown by that. To come with, Jesus was a victim of sexual abuse as part of crucifixion, that's just such a difficult conversation to have. That said, most church people, in my experience, when they've overcome the first shock, surprise, and gone beyond the headline or the title of the talk that they're coming to, and often they'll say, I came along tonight because I really couldn't understand this at all, so I wanted to hear what you were saying, but you're absolutely right. And I was told Jesus was naked when he was crucified. That part of the idea is not new to people.
Right.
But what you're saying, that this is sexual abuse, that's new. I've never heard that before. It is being talked about more now, I think. So it's partly Christians for churches are not good about talking about sex. They're not good talking about Jesus and sex. They're certainly not good talking about Jesus' sexual abuse altogether. So this really is throwing some people in at a deep end, and does need to be done carefully and thoughtfully, and in a way that takes people where they are.
Yeah, I was so struck by in that chapter where you're talking about why this matters. You talk about sexual abuse. You want to be really clear that this doesn't diminish a victim. And for me as a victim of sexual violence, reading that, of course, I think that part of the reticence of talking about Jesus as a victim of sexual violence is that we do have this stigma, at least, if not, kind of punitive way of dealing with victims, that actually we think of sexual violence as something that diminishes someone. Yeah. So I wonder if you could just reflect on that. What role is stigma and or more playing in this conversation?
I think it's huge, and actually this idea surfaces it. So many people will say, no, we don't stigmatize victims. We wouldn't. That would be wrong and unchristian and uncaring and loving. And yet when you explore this idea, there is for many people a deep conviction that actually a reason to resist this way of thinking of Jesus is because it lessens Jesus. And for some people, it would be hard to imagine Jesus as a savior if he has been lessened in this way. So this isn't just about Jesus. It's about their salvation and what it means to, what sort of savior would it be? Now, I think all of that is muddled thinking about who is to blame and who is lessened by sexual violence and sexual abuse. Jesus is not lessened. That I would say is one of the fundamental lessons that needs to be insisted on. Jesus is not lessened by being subjected to sexual violence and torture, and nor is any victim of torture or person who experiences sexual violence. And that alone makes this conversation, although it's difficult, really worth happening. Yeah. Because you can get to that point where people who say, oh, yes, I believe that. Oh, but I didn't feel that. When we actually started talking about Jesus, I actually felt the opposite to what I say I believe. But you're quite right. Jesus isn't lessened by this. And, well, why did I feel that then? That was a really interesting sensation, but it was there. So, yes, it does speak about the power of stigma and then who gets blamed for things. I think there is a tendency to blame somebody who talks about this idea and to sort of transfer some of the, well, you're wrong for doing that. But even if it was factually wrong, I don't think it is, but even if it was, it's a strange reaction. Some people have very, very hostile blaming reactions. It's not just, I think you're mistaken on the history, but actually this is sacrilegious. It's sacrilegious, blasphemous. Yeah. I think Michelle Bolsonaro, the former First Lady in Brazil, described it as Christophobia, which was a new word for me. So this is hatred of Jesus. I don't think it's fear of Jesus, but hatred of Jesus, insanity and lack of scruples. And then, just to underline the point, she cited Galatians, where there was a clear suggestion that there'd be payment back in kind. So it was a very, a very hostile, negative reaction. There's no sense of, well, this is helping us to see the experiences of torture victims and to think through why it's the torturer who's so deplorable. But rather it's the blame being put on somebody who said, this is the experience Jesus was subjected to. So I think it is quite revealing that way. It does tell us, for people who may not be aware, Michelle Bolsonaro would identify as very much an evangelical Pentecostal Christian. So she's speaking from a deep faith perspective in those terms. This isn't just this, for her, strange idea about Jesus. This is something that she feels is very close to her heart. But when you look at what she said when these ideas were discussed in April 2022 in a Brazilian newspaper, she was extremely hostile and encouraged others to be hostile as well. Yeah,
that's an interesting. This is a rabbit trail. I'm not going to go down it, but it's interesting to set that alongside sort of the masculinization of Jesus in some of those circles and some of that conversation, and how we still have this notion that if someone has been subjected to sexual violence, somehow it damages, in some sense, not just their personhood, but their masculinity. I wonder if that's a way of thinking about kind of what's going on in that framework. But
it is, and that's why the Romans did it.
Right. Right,
Exactly.
precisely. So it's still working the same.
It's not a strange thing.
It's the same way.
Completely buying into what the Romans were doing and accepting that framework.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's such an important conversation, but it's just so hard. So I want to ask, I think maybe one, maybe two final questions. One is, you have a lot of sympathy for Christian art that covers Jesus. And I find that very interesting. Thinking about, I've been very influenced by just Will Gaffney's short little article on kind of Jesus as sexual, victim of sexual violence, but also this notion that we're so embarrassed by Jesus' nakedness that we cover him up. Why do you think the covering, how can we read that positively?
Yeah. So I suppose this is something I have come to. It's taken me a bit of time. Initially, I think I would have seen the covering up in negative terms. And I think seeing a cover up as a cover up as something which is bad, I don't dispute that at all. I think that's also a good reading of it. But for the SCM book, which I published with Jayme Reaves and Rocío Figueroa in 2021, which was a collection gathering people together to discuss these ideas, particularly around the stripping.
Called When Did We See You Naked?
Exactly.
If you're looking for that one. I'm sorry, go on.
No, absolutely. That title we did, of course, take from Matthew 25. And it's the parable of the sheep and goats, or the parable of judgment. And Jesus is saying, or Jesus is telling the parable, and in the parable, it's the king who is saying to the people, when did you do this? When did you do that? And both the sheep and the goats reply as they do, when did we see you? And one of the significant things I think about that chapter is we don't read that chapter in the light of Jesus on the cross. And obviously it's 2 chapters earlier. It's Matthew 25, not Matthew 27. But it's only days separate if we accept the sort of narrative scheme that Jesus is already in Jerusalem and so on and so on. Within days of saying to people, when I was naked, he is naked and it's not seen. And that was why we used the title for the book, encouraging people to focus on, what's going on that Jesus actually says, when did you see me naked? And it's very, very unusual for people to see Jesus naked in that sense. The response which he encourages, and I think it is right, is to clothe, is to cover. And that did help me think about the Christian artists who have covered Jesus in a more positive way. This is obviously a completely inadequate response to sexual abuse and having somebody naked on the cross, but at least it's something. At least it's a gesture towards the dignity which has been stripped away and removed. It doesn't solve the problem, but I'm now more inclined to read it in a positive way, that it is seeking to put back the dignity which has been stripped away. So I suppose it's still focusing on the stripping away of dignity in terms of that's what's behind the scene. But for the artist to put the loincloth onto Jesus in the image is signaling that something has gone very wrong here and some response should be made. I do think for the vast majority of people, they've completely forgotten that Jesus was naked. The loincloth is therefore, I wouldn't for a minute disagree with Will Gaffney, that the loincloth is therefore covering up and allowing people to not see what they should be seeing. So that there's definitely that reading as well. That's not wrong, but I think we could see the loincloth as a more positive response, as long as we've got this understanding of what's behind it.
And what are your hopes for this book?
So for the Routledge book, which is in a series edited by Johanna Stiebert, it was a chance to set out the argument at length. That when we published the SCM book, When Did We See You Naked, had quite a conversation as whether we needed to state the argument or whether the argument was already widely available and we should move on to sort of new perspectives and new ways of thinking about this. And in the end, we decided to include a first chapter that gave the argument in something of an abridged form. I'm really pleased we did, because that book showed us just how much people find it difficult to accept that Jesus could possibly have been exposed to sexual abuse. And if we hadn't had that first chapter, I think the problem would have been even worse. There was still plenty of people who assured us there was no evidence of this. So with the Routledge book, it's an opportunity to not just state the argument in an abridged form, but in a dramatically expanded form, and to set it out as clearly as possible. Some of my objectives were as to, well, how did I come to this? What was it for me? And it was this story of a Salvadoran execution and just how brutally misogynistic that is. And that is part of the reality. And also part of the reality is that doesn't get talked about. So it's both of those things, extreme violence and extreme silence, and sexual violence very much at the heart of that. Then to set out the stripping, as to why it is for stripping, or strippings, plural, provide, to my mind, a really clear, firm basis to see Jesus as a victim of sexual violence or sexual abuse. I think sexual violence is a technically better term, but sexual abuse helps us to make the pastoral connections more clearly, to my mind, at least, particularly in light of the institutional abuse crisis, the UK and Ireland and the US. We now have the Royal Commission in New Zealand. It is baffling for me the church's lack of curiosity about Jesus's experience in terms of thinking through the institutional abuse crisis. I cannot understand why there isn't more engagement by church leaders with this. So to set that out, the strippings, then to explore the mocking, because that, I think, is an area there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And then I have been working on the crucifixion and impalement for a long time, and have finally got that in a form which I think is ready to be shared. But also because in recent years I have been working with a Peruvian colleague, Rocío Figueroa, on the pastoral implications, the pastoral messages, it seems, which can come out from this. You are not alone. You are not to blame. Two of the most important messages that the churches can be offering, and a really strong Christological basis for that. Not in any way to suggest that this only matters because it happened to Jesus, and that we need Jesus to have experienced this to see that sexual abuse is wrong. It's not that we have to see Jesus in this way for sexual abuse to be a problem, but the fact that Jesus also experienced it, and it's been covered up or lost to memory or ignored, or when you bring up the issue, you get attacked for bringing it up. All of these issues are highly relevant still for survivors and their experience, because I've been doing that work increasingly. And we've had chance to interview groups of survivors and talk to them. Do you find this helpful? Why? Why not? Do you find it persuasive? Why? Why not? And to hear those views, it was a chance to have that fourth chapter. I hope that continues. I think there is more work which can be done on the historical side, and it is good to do that work. But for me as a theologian rather than the biblical scholar, it's the practical application for this, and to some extent the theological reading of it as well, that would be my big hopes.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us, David, and for writing this well-researched, well-argued book that engages deeply with primary sources. I feel like we got some of that in this interview, but I just want to encourage our listeners to go and have a read yourself. Mercifully, this book is only, I think, 81 pages long. I think after 81 pages of reading some of this, that was enough, because it's quite a heavy it's a heavy topic, obviously, and filled with some just really, really horrific things. So I just want to say thanks for doing that work. Thanks for joining us on this podcast. And thanks to you, OnScript listeners. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Erin.
You've been listening to OnScript, delectable conversations on scripture and theology. If this episode has brought you inner peace or lit your biblical fire, please consider a small donation of just $2 or $5 per month. Information on how to donate can be found at onscript.study/donate.